Hey everybody, thanks for coming today. I'm Matt Arias. I'm the Vice President here at Intuit. Today we have a very interesting panel that's associated with the show that's in our main gallery from the MADmusée. We have Jerry Stifel, who is one of our board members here at Intuit and an associate professor at the School of the Art Institute. We have Randy Vick, who is also associate professor at the School of the Art Institute in Art Therapy, and Pierre Muylle, did I say that right?
No, but it's
No. Who is the director of the MADmusée in Liège, Belgium, which you see up on the screen there. So without further ado, I will let them go ahead.
Okay, I'm just going to ask some questions of Randy and Pierre. And we'll start with Pierre. If you could say something, I mean, the image that's up is the new MADmusée in Liège. But I'd like to know something about the founding of the museum and the idea of a museum by people with various exceptionalities.
MADmusée is not like you see it there. It's in a small pavilion of the 60s in a park in Liège, Belgium. Liège is a French-speaking city in Belgium, next to the German border, next to the Dutch border, but in Belgium you're always next to a border somewhere. It started, the whole story of MADmusée and of the collection started when Luc Boulanger, an artist from Liège, squatted this pavilion in the park. It used to be a pavilion where people go to dance and listen to music, but it was not used anymore for a long time already, and it was empty. And he went there with a group of disabled artists that he invited first in his studio and in other places for temporary projects. They went in this place to make to work there and to make their first exhibition. And they got a letter from the city hall to say that they have to evacuate the place. And at the same time, the mayor was invited to come to see the exhibition. He came, he saw the exhibition, and he said, well, you can stay here, and you can have the place, you can stay here forever to develop your work, because I really like what you're doing. And since then, they were there. And it was Créam that was created there. Créam is one of the first of this kind of studios that are organized outside of outside of the institution, outside of care organizations. They organized artistic studio for mentally disabled people. But artistic studio means fine arts studio, theater, dance, music, different kinds of artistic practice. Not how do you say? Not together with people from the care center or
Social service.
No, not a social service, but with together with artists, professional artists that were there also to work with them. And it was rather new because it's after the whole movement of the end of the 60s, and a lot of people that started there in the 80s then created this more kind of more institutionalized, no? more organized structures of this kind, and it's more or less the same period like when Creative Road started in Oakland. They were a little bit earlier, but it's the same area. It was something in the air, I don't know. And from the beginning on, they also invited other studios, other artists. They created other creative studios in Europe and other cities. They took over the same way of work or structure, and they invited them to Liège, and they invited also other artists from the city to be involved and to integrate in their work. And it was a really important cultural player in the city, together with others. And so they started also to have pieces from our own studio and from other artists, and this is the start of the collection. So it was not a collection in the beginning, it was just pieces they had.
An assembly.
An assembly of own productions and pieces from others. And it began to be a collection when someone really started to work on that, to work on exhibiting and collecting within the studio. And then the studio moved out to another place in Liège, and the collection stayed, and this was then the museum. In 2008, it was really recognized by the Ministry of Culture as a museum. Before that, it was an art center, but it was already separated from the studio activity. And now we have 2,300 pieces in the collection. We have 4 exhibitions a year in this place, in our own exhibition space, and also other exhibitions in other places like the one we have here. And we have a documentation center, which is also a very important reference within the museum. We have the collection and the documentation center that is specialized in books and catalogs of studios, but also on a broader field of outsider art, brut, monographical publications, but also collections and books about environments and architecture and everything that has to do with architecture that is not made by architects. So, and also, of course, the more classical museum things like educational department. And we have a very small team, and we are a small museum, but I think we are working now in a very exciting moment where the potential of the artists that we are defending is more and more recognized on different levels in different places in Europe, in North America, in Japan, and things that were unthinkable 5 years ago are now reality, like outsider artists being presented at the Venice Biennale, or artists that we have in the collection that all of a sudden are recognized also in other bigger collections, or collections that were very doubtful about the quality of their work, now start to see, yeah, but maybe it's interesting. And for us, it's very exciting to be part of that, or to be able to think about how do we develop within these new possibilities and this new this change to bring out the potential that we feel this whole field has.
So it started just like within the Korean group, the different studios first started bringing work there, and then studios beyond that. You know how? Because I can understand. Okay, if we're all part of the same. I mean, this is not the right word, but the same franchise. You know, we're all part of this Collection model. I can understand sharing the work back and forth that way. But at some point, other studios started coming in, or did the MADmusée reach out to those studios and say, hey, we have something interesting going here? And
I'll give you an example. In the 80s was also the start of the European Union projects of exchange within the European Union. The European Union was starting to be more visible and more active in the cultural field as well. And Korea entered the project to do a big exchange project with the 12 states of the European Union at that moment, and 12 studios where they started to exchange works and do a big billboard campaign in these 12 cities with works from the different studios. And this, a lot of works that are now in the collection are a result of that project, where pieces were traded or came to the museum for the billboard project or for an exhibition and stayed there. And so it's it's really a result of an activity of expositions, exhibiting, and being active in that field that brought works to the collection.
And you're also collecting around Europe, because I know you just got back from Italy. And you've also selected some works from Project Onward here in Chicago.
Yes, that's how we work now. But I mean, what
historically,
it was really directly linked to. But Stephanie, you can add if you think that there are other examples. But I think the one of Brewed is a good example. That a lot of works historically came from this kind of exchanges. Now we provoke this. We go
actively on the hunt.
Actively go to see studios, to meet them, to go again to see how it evolved. We have a very active communication with a lot of studios around the world, and we are seeking to open that up. Like for this, the exhibition that we have here is very important for the collection of the museum as well. Not only to show what we have, but to the fact that we were here and had contact with Project Onward, with Little City, that they know what we are doing, that they are trusting how we work, and so that they donated some works and that we bought some works, and that this is really part of the whole dynamic of being a museum. You can't just sit there, look at the pieces that are waiting to be shown, and wait until new ones are coming in. So that's how we work now.
Okay, and Randy, just to interface with what Pierre was saying with the museum and going out to these various studios or ateliers, would you comment just on the idea of the artist with disabilities within the history of art? And when does this begin to really develop after the institutional aspects of psychiatric clinics?
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was interesting, Pierre, you pointed to that time in the late 70s when places like Creative Growth and so forth were beginning to kind of pop up sort of spontaneously and without really any connection, overt connections with each other. And the story of how Kayem started is the story that's often part of that. It's the artist who somehow had this idea of outreach. But I think it also had to be at a moment when people were leaving institutions. It was not that long ago that people lived their entire lives in institutions. People with developmental disabilities their families brought them to institutions. They were advised to bring them to institutions because it would be too big a burden on them, and these became huge warehouses of people, and they sort of disappeared into those for the rest of their lives. And it wasn't that long ago that people with mental illness had really no options for active treatment, and they would enter the hospital and spend the rest of their lives there. So the story of someone like Otto Fulfley, who's such a iconic psychiatric artist from that art brut tradition, he didn't make art before, went into the hospital, spent the rest of his days there. Martin Ramirez, same thing. You hear that story over and over again. But what was happening in the 60s and 70s, those places were being opened up. And, there were, in terms of psychiatry, there was more effective kind of treatments. People didn't have to be kept the rest of their lives. For people with disabilities, there was a real shift in mindset about why do people, this is not impossible to live in your community, it's not impossible to live with your family. And institutions really opened up, sometimes with great suddenness. All of a sudden people found themselves, out in the world without the supports they needed. But I think it was because people now were back in the community that the artists began to have these connections, and that it happened so many times, not through social service organizations, but through artistic organizations, I think is a really interesting element of that.
I'm really surprised in discovering also this whole history of what you're talking about and how it developed differently in different countries.
Mm-hmm.
And Italy for me is a very interesting example because it is so like everything in Italy. It's so beautiful but so rough and at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
It's before the late 60s, people with psychiatrical backgrounds or with mental disability or even drugs problems or some kind of criminals also,
Mhm.
they were just all
Lumped together.
lumped together in manicomi, and these are big like prisons, let's say. It's closed. And once you're there, you don't come out again. It was really out of the society and a very, very brutal situation. And it's after the Second World War, and much after the Second World War in the 60s, that a psychiatrist from Venice, Basaglia said this is not possible. We saw what we saw in the Second World War, and we cannot tolerate this as a community, as a society. We cannot tolerate that we deal with these people in that kind of way. We have to do something.
It was an echo of the genocide they saw in
Yes.
camps. And
And so he really fought for that cause, and the answer that he got was yes, but these people are unadapted to live in society. They are dangerous. And he said, of course they are. If you lock them up all their lives and you let them live in this kind of circumstances, and you give them drugs, and you cannot accept that they are adapted to live in society. So what we have to do is to open the doors gradually and to stop to give them medication. And so anti-psychiatry started from this. And what I think is interesting in regard to the workshops is that he did this by inviting artists to the hospital where he works, from theater, but also performance artists. Also, I forgot his name. Very known.
Carlos? No.
A music composer from contemporary music. Forgot his name. Went there and they worked together with the people from the hospital.
That's still within the walls of the hospital.
Within the walls of the hospital, but then they made a big blue horse, like the horse of Troy, a big blue horse, and they wanted to get the horse out and then follow the horse in the village and in the city.
But Marco Cavallo, the horse?
Yes, yes, and but the horse was too big, and so they had to break down the wall to get him out, and so it's a very nice symbolic gesture of breaking down the wall, pushing the horse out, and having this procession of these people being in the city, and a very direct thing. But again, what I think is important is that they didn't call the army or politicians or a bank or no, they called artists to do that, and I think this is important because it gives also a very social pertinence to an artistic position, and I think this is also what a lot of artists think is interesting in the studios as well, that they are looking for, is to be part of that, part of an artistic thing where you will accept that you are an artist, but an artist that is in a social context with even political consequences of what you do. In regard of what you said about including these people also, with mental disabilities in society.
Okay. That whole idea of breaking out of the institutions takes us to the whole topic of influence and popular culture. And Adolf Ruffli, I mean, he used popular culture advertisements in some of his collages and everything, like Andy Warhol did 50 years later. But
He used Campbell's tomato soup.
right, yes. What about that feeling of influence from the institutions and now in the studios? How has that affected the work? Do you notice any changes in the work from when it was institutionalized to?
Well, Rob has
Studio.
written, Rob
Right.
Lenz, who directs the Project Onward, has written an article in this.
I just happen to have it right here.
Of the Outsider on the topic, and I think that it has a really interesting history, and I think this, as many things in this particular field, it goes back to Dubuffet. And Dubuffet had this, I think, fantasy about being completely removed from all influence.
Mm-hmm.
That somehow the influence of society was suffocating to creativity, and that any kind of influence was damaging to the creative act. And so, you know, to his logic of that then was that people who were removed from society, living institutions for instance, were untainted by the influence. And I just think that that has never been true. It certainly wasn't true for Wolfley, who was really his icon of the pure outsider. I mean, we see that he was not only using magazine ads that somehow found their way to the hospital that he was in outside of Bern, Switzerland, but they were English language magazines, many of them. So there was, you know, all kinds of influences flowing in, and the idea that, you know, you're not influenced by society. These hospitals, they were like small towns. They were their own societies as well, and people were clearly within that influence. And I would argue, you know, why would you, and obviously from a therapeutic point of view, why would you want someone disconnected from their world? So I think it becomes a question in these kinds of studios, because it's like, okay, who are the people who are bringing the materials, who are making some curatorial choices about what goes on the wall, who, you know, in some other direct and indirect ways may be impacting the artwork. So I think the best places, the facilitators become, they support, they enable, but they don't put too much of their own fingerprints on things. And I think that that's not, it's easier to say that than to do that sometimes, because I think those influences can be subtle, but you know, the idea that someone is living in a bubble completely uninfluenced, I think is a fantastic idea. I don't think it happens.
No, and I don't think it's a good thing to enforce. I'm Françoise Rouge from DAES. DAES is another studio in Belgium, and a lot of artists that are on display here, some of them come from that studio. She's very active. She invites a lot of artists also from the comic world to work together with on some projects, a lot of edition, publishing, etc. And she had critics on that in the beginning from people that come from a good background, saying, yes, but you influence too much your artists. They were so good in the beginning, and now they are influenced, and it changed. She said, yeah, so what? I mean, it's not my job to make them unhappy and depressed and isolated and so that they would make better work. My job is to integrate them in society as well, and to produce a context that is rewarding for what they are doing, and that to show the work and to etc. And that's a consequence of that. You cannot develop as a professional artist and stay in your studio. It's part of being an artist. If you are an amateur artist, then it's really no problem to stay in your studio and just focus on your creative activity. When you want to be a professional artist, you have, beside this creative activity in your studio, a whole range of other activity that has to do with like a producer for music, or distribution, about reflection, inviting people to write about your work, inviting what we are doing now, talking about it, etc. And this is what makes the difference between a professional artistic practice and amateur. And a good amateur is just perfect. They have very beautiful studios, most of them better equipped than most other artists, because they really like that part of it.
Mm-hmm.
But don't ask,
Full easel. And
yes,
all,
but don't ask them, don't bother them with inviting someone to be critical about their work. That's not the point.
Mhm.
And I think it's the same with studios. In a studio, there are several artists that are just there because they enjoy being there and because they are making something, and that's it. And no need to have more. Though all of a sudden some of them develop something else where there is an envy to also to do more than only that, and to go out with the work and to interfere or the people that are working in the studio recognize that the work has more potential, that it's almost pushing to get out and to be seen, and to put in motion a whole new development around the work.
Well, there becomes a dialogue. I mean, someone makes the work and someone sees the work, and there's a conversation. There are two artists working separately, and they come together and they begin to respond to each other. When work enters the marketplace, there's another kind of response that happens, and all those things I think are part of the mainstream art world, and I wonder why they become so suspect when you translate them to these studios. And I think it's that echo of Dubuffet that somehow they're no longer pure. But if the model is, and you used the term a couple times, of professional, if this is truly saying this is an artist who this is an artist. This is a profession, rather than this is a helpless or damaged person, but this is someone who is making a contribution to the world, a professional contribution to the world, then that whole dynamic shifts, I think.
Well, I think that also takes us into the whole realm of ethics that is a dialogue that everybody has had, a very critical dialogue, but the ethics relating to the personal biography, the public presence, and the whole idea of buying and selling these artists' works. These basically self-taught, but they're working within the studio system. They're being influenced with iPads, just with the electronic media that we have today. So what about that whole aspect of buying and selling the work? And I think we can throw that out to a lot of the collectors that are in the audience.
I just think that there's nothing wrong with being part of an art market in a way, but it can be very wrong. And we don't necessarily have to make, this is rather new for this, in this context that we are working in, to have this kind of questions about markets, because there was no interest from the market, so we didn't care. But now that this interest is growing, we don't necessarily have to accept that we have to play with the same rules, or that we have to make the same mistakes like happened in the normal art market, and to evolve towards a system that has a big soap bubble that can explode any second, and that has lost its connection with what it really is. I mean, when I was talking about this reality of the creation in your studio and enjoying creating that, at the moment that you finished your creation and it goes to a place where someone says, yeah, this is something that will float up there, and we don't know anymore where it comes from or who made it, but all we know is that it's just replaced by $10 million. It's $10 million. It not anymore. It has not anymore a relation with what it really is. It's only something that has to go in a safe box, and that's it. And
It's a commodity.
Yes, and I think this is something that we have to be really aware of when stepping into a market system, that this relation between what it's worth and what it is, that this is still there. That when Pascal Tassigny is sold through a gallery to a collectioner, that this collector, when he buys the piece, gives a fair price for it, of course. There's no reason why he should be sold for less, but that it's not a price that makes it only a price, and that it's still a work of Pascal Tassigny, that the collector still knows who he is, where it comes from, and what it is. And I think this is the kind of things where it's very important that the studios and the people working in the studios, and because they are dealing with this price question and with this ethical questions also, or questions about who we are working with, to which collection it goes, etc., that they know where they are stepping in, and they need to be prepared to answer this kind of questions. And this is a problem. There are a lot of studio responsibles, or people that are
Representatives,
directors, they are totally not prepared to this kind of questions. And I can give the example of Pascal Tassigny that works in Cream in Liège.
And he's the one who builds the environments?
Yes, and the bowls with the knots that are there. Cream was totally not prepared that when we did the show with the catalog 3 years ago, 4 years ago, 3 years ago, that after that Collection Brut in Lausanne and Collection La Racine in Lille were interested in having his pieces in the collection. So Christian Best from Paris Gallery was also interested in showing him. A lot of collectors were interested, wanted to buy the work, and the work that they sold for €50 the year before, all of a sudden were sold for €5,000 in a gallery in Paris. And yes, what do you do then? Well,
So wait a second, they were bought, that object, that single object was bought for 50 and then sold for 5,000? Or you're saying his work in general, while it was sold at one point, was
Yes.
50, then was 5,000?
was then 100 times.
So the gallerist didn't come in, buy them at 50 and sell them at
No,
5,000?
no, no.
Yeah.
No, but
That changed the marketplace.
the marketplace changed very, very much in a very short period, and the responsible from the studio is not ready to answer questions about what now. Is his production fast enough to answer to this questions from collectors? Are they okay with selling this to collectors, or does his work need to first to be in some collections, public collections in important museums before it can go to collectors? Are we working with this gallery or with another gallery? Is there all these kind of questions are questions that you really have to give answer to, and they were not ready for that.
Well, but those are different. Those could be different strategies. You could say we first want to have some of the work placed publicly before we begin to sell it to individuals. Or you could take another strategy and you say, let's release the work into the market, see what happens when it becomes to be known and appreciated, and then perhaps it enters into institutions.
But who's making those decisions?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
The people that are running the workshop?
Exactly.
I mean,
how do those strategies get decided? Because those are very different kinds of strategies that you could also say, and I think it's very instructive to look at these kind of questions by flipping it over and saying, okay, now let's not talk about an artist with a disability anymore in a studio. Let's now talk about just a mainstream artist.
Mhm.
And you could look at a mainstream artist as being the same kind of debate in their own head, or debate with their representative or their dealer, and you know.
Well, it goes into an aesthetic, the simplest aesthetic theory is the art is made when the art becomes discussed, collected, it's art. And that no matter what it is, no matter who the artist is, but just that simple pathway, it becomes art, and who knows what the market is going to do with it then.
Yes, but it's a difference when the artists themselves are not
Make those decisions or are
Yes.
able to make
They
them.
need representation because they're not.
Yes, and they are
But-
well represented when we see it on the level of the studio. On that level, it's really perfect. I don't know any studio where there's a big problem in this relationship within the creational context. When it goes to another level in selling and etc., then
That's
you
trickier.
see it's tricky because they are, most of them are not used to interfere in this kind of discussions or make this kind of decisions. They are a bit I don't know.
I'm sorry, but one of the things that, you know, when you hear creative growth, I mean, they happen to have a director who is a genius in marketing, but in some ways, I look at that negatively. And I always wonder how that affects the work that's coming out of creative growth into the market.
Because of the selection of like their
Well,
own
I
internal
mean,
selection of the
taking
superstar
the work
promotion.
and having people who maybe don't have the same artistic talent but are in the workshop making hooked rugs out of the work of some of the people who really are artists. And then jacking that up to an unreal price. It just, I always kind of wonder about it.
Well, is that the art form of the curator and the marketer?
You mean they're making,
What?
They're commercializing.
they're having unskilled people repeat the skilled work.
In hooked
And-
rugs
oh, I
and
didn't
things
even
like
know
that.
Because I didn't know that, but, you know, there are levels, some of those, any of those, they do have their superstars. I mean, there are lots of people who come there daily, who, it is
Some are better than
and it's a
others.
therapeutic exercise that gives them pleasure and offers what, you know, help for health and well-being reasons. And then there are those who are, quote, artists
Yes.
and have risen above, sort of, there's certain, you can name the people from each group
Right.
that
Well,
have established a certain reputation and their work is more desirable.
Right.
And I work at an institution where there are greater and lesser level of talents. It's the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. And there are students who graduate and go on to have careers that are very highly visible, and others, who don't. And so, I think that that's true when, in any sort of realm of capacity and in any sort of sample of human beings. Some people are better at whatever it is, kicking a football, making art, doing math, than other people within that sample. So in some ways that we shouldn't be all that surprised by.
Right, and is that any different than the American Folk Art Museum having built trailer scarves?
Right. You had a question or a comment?
Well, I was going to say, I mean, didn't some artists who were discovered sort of after they died, you
Oh,
know?
man.
I mean, the point is, it's nice if they're discovered while they're still alive. Because some of these, in the mainstream art, these artists were really died penniless, but,
I just think of Henry Darger, we have.
I'm not
Darger
speaking
room.
of outsider art, I mean,
But I mean,
Picasso,
Darger too.
wasn't he?
was
He
penniless.
wasn't, I don't know how.
Oh, no.
No.
He was
No,
very
Picasso
But
was
some
very-
people in his generation are recognized now,
Yeah.
but they weren't appreciated until afterwards. So I guess if there's an opportunity to recognize, you know, for this artist to reap the reward, that's a good thing. You know, but the particulars of how that's implemented, I guess, has to be worked out.
Yeah.
It seems to me that there's two sort of competing but similar interests. One in supporting the individual as an artist, and also for the studios to somewhat market their work so that the studio can continue to provide those services even to potentially greater people. One issue I see, and I'd like to get your thoughts on it, is in a place like, I'll use like when I visited Little City, there are individuals there every day continuing to make more and more and more work, and it piles up, and there's just more of it than any one person could ever collect or purchase or sell or do stuff with, right? And you see that we'll just talk within the outsider realm for a while. There are people that cranked out a lot of work, and there are people that did very few work either for their age, their interest in it, right? But you have varying levels, and I think that bears out, and when you have that market, that obviously the less quantity of work there is, and the greater demand, the price rises. But within the studio context, in some cases, you have people producing work virtually nonstop for many, many years. How in the long run, does that affect what you're trying to talk about with getting it out in the marketplace?
Well, I would say I'm happy that we, as a museum, that we don't have to deal with the market anyway. We see, like you say, we have some artists in the collection. We have that we have few works because there is few work. There is not much, and others are making the quantity is part of the work. The fact that they Manu Massimo, that you is he here for this with the faces, he's always making the same kind of faces, and again and again and again and again, and they all are different, but they all have the same basic structure. When we go to visit the studio, now the studio is in a very bad situation with the management of the hospital where they are in, etc. No, it's not Latinaya. It's Adriano Luquen. And we were talking with them about the future, and they said, well, what will we do with Nano Massimo's work if we have to move? And she opens the door, and there is piles and piles and piles and piles of these faces, different papers, different colors, different anything. But this is part of the work, the fact that it is so massive. But of course, if you want to put this into a market thinking, it is tricky, because if it is impossible to put a high price on that one paper that is part of these piles of paper that would fill the room here. So it's that's the thing where I say that the studios are completely able, if they want to really think about that, to do things differently, not to follow the same logics and the same rules of the regular art market, and to say yes, but yes, art, we want to sell things, and yes, it's important for an artist that his work is sold. But let's do it in a way that we are familiar with, that is close to the reality of the artist, close to our reality. We are not galleries. Yes.
But it's very interesting. Massimo is this artist? Yes. Okay, so Massimo has his reasons for working the way he does. No one may know what those are, but he does. So he works in a way that he's highly prolific. So I guess you could say at that point, are we to empower Massimo to work the way he works? Are we to support him in that? Or are we to say, Massimo, dear boy, you're flooding the market, and so we're going to need you back off. So we're going to give you a smaller stack of paper to go from, or we're going to say, continue to work on that until it's done, or we're going to say, we're going to give you materials that are more resistive, so you have to sort of struggle with them to produce fewer works. I mean, that's an intervention. I'm theorizing here. And then you could say, now I'm the person in the place of the gallerist at this particular studio, and I will strategically release the right amount of work that I feel to optimize his career and his market. I'm not going to put out everything he does, because if I lay it all out, I'll say there are some that are better than others, clearly. And so I'm going to be very selective as the gallerist in terms of what I show and what I sell, and maybe even what I reserve for our own permanent collection, because these are the best ones. But then I might be a curator and say, Massimo's art is not about a single drawing, but Massimo's art is about his mount volume of art, and that in itself is a conceptual project that must be seen in its entirety, in its volume. So those are actually at the level of Massimo, at the gallerist, and at that external curator level. Those are three very different projects and very different strategies.
That's why I think that the role of the people that are working with Massimo on a daily basis in the north of Italy, in this studio, that they are crucial in all these decisions. So to be sure that whatever decision is made, and different decisions can be made simultaneously. You can say for an exhibition that you follow the choice of the curator, and then invite the gallerist to do something else with him. That's not a problem. But in any case, that it is always linked to the reality of Mano Massimo, and that his people that are working with him know him enough and to defend his right to be, and not to be slave of his own work or the decisions that are made by others about his work, but that he is still on the driving wheel of his own work. And I think that's why it's really important that the studio, people that work in the studio, know a lot about the studio and also what's happening outside of it, so that they can be bridge. I think they are really important bridge figures for these artists, and they really need them to achieve relationships that are of quality.
And Pierre, as a closing,
Yeah,
because
just-
we are just about finished,
Yeah.
you had an image that you wanted to talk about?
Yeah, I thought it was very
It's not
relevant.
there is something. I have a little rainbow turning around.
The beach ball from hell.
Yes. Jane?
Well, part of this problem too is just because of what's happening today with more and more people being aware and accepting this kind of work. Because Henry Darters were around for years, and so were Ramirez's. And people, certain people like us valued them, and many, many others didn't until there was a major museum show, maybe 20 years later in New York, and then suddenly Henry Darter is like the hottest thing, in the country. But it took a period of time.
Right.
Now, there's so much, there are more scholars in the field, there are more people being interested, there's more effort by organizations like ours to get it into the mainstream. So I think it's becoming more of a contemporary issue than perhaps it was years ago when Suzanne was beating the bushes and
That's
Bill
also
Swislow.
that's also a generational
Right.
thing that we feel a lot in discussions in Europe. With,
Yeah, young art
especially
students,
with
they don't
people-
see the difference
No.
today.
But in Europe, it's the same with the people that were close to the buffet and the whole art brut generation. That there are people that they really want to keep it like that. They fought to say no. We cannot have relationship. We cannot become contemporary. This has to be something for us. We are together,
Secret.
and we know it,
Our
and we
secret.
have
Yeah.
our own secrets, and we don't want to share it. And it took a while to change that and to open it up. But I have respect for that. I think it is a beautiful, romantic
It's very
projection
romantic.
of these people discovering things and being the first to see and etc. But it is not real anymore. It changed, like you say. It is a big difference in the generations.
Well, you think about even Bill Traylor selling his drawings for 25 cents tops in the early 40s, and now, I mean, Carl Hammer's exhibition, I think the least expensive was $90,000 for one of those Bill Traylor drawings, and they're coveted in major museums around the world. So, yeah, that
Well,
60,
I mean,
70-year period.
You know, just the marketing of James Castle, for instance, a huge
Mhm.
body of work suddenly was, and he had piles of work. He worked for 50 years. You know, there's a whole house full of the work. But they were very savvy, but they only sold a few pieces at a time. Had some small exhibitions and some bigger ones in it. You know, they grew the market in a very smart way.
Which again, it was after
Which
he had
is
died.
After he
Right.
died.
And so,
Right.
you know, it didn't impact his working practice.
No.
You know, whether or not he would have had the wherewithal to have been part of that decision making even when he was alive, but it becomes purely then a commodity and in some ways a legacy of this family member.
Right, but at the same time, right, they didn't throw it away.
Right.
Someone in the family, so many of these artists who are dead, a grandson, maybe a couple generations later, someone in the family realizes the value and begins to work on.
Well, we see that with Chris Preissing and Charles Steffen's work here in Chicago.
Right.
I was once in the same kind of debate in Europe, and someone asked, is it art or something like that? And another one answered, but who cares? And he answered, who cares, in a way to just avoid the question. But if you really ask the question, who cares? I think this is the whole thing. Who cares? Who cares about the work? And who decided that this is something you don't just throw away when you clean up the attic of the new house you bought, but that you look at it and that you care, that you say, yes, this is something I can't throw away, this is something of value, this is something, and each and every of these discoveries you were talking about is linked to a whole story of having someone on a certain moment like case.
And in closing?
Yes. No. It was just. I think this is the next exhibition that we will organize in Liège. The next monographical exhibition. After Matt curated a show in Liège of our collection in kind of echo to the exhibition here. And after that.
So this is called Brewed in Belgium.
Yes, Brewed in Belgium, and there is Brewed in Chicago. It's both our collection. And after that, we will have the Bellucci's exhibition. Every year we do a monographical exhibition of an artist from the collection, together with a catalog. And the catalogs are in the shop. You'll see it's beginning to be a nice series. This will be the next one in this series, and I think it's a good example of a biography that gives a lot of questions about things that we talked about. Maybe I can just tell it and then we don't have to do it again. Franco Bellucci is rather old. I think he's almost 70, and he lives. Maybe à quel âge?
Thanks a lot.
Oh, sorry.
He's ancient.
He's antique. And
he's still alive?
Stop it.
He lives in Livorno, in Italy, in Centro Basaglia, in Livorno, and he lived in the period before Basaglia in institution. So he lived in this manicomi regime that I've been talking about earlier,
It's sort of prison-like
Yes.
institution.
And there he took from the wall with bare hands cables and tubes and everything that he could detach from the wall to wrap around objects that he found that
Yeah.
were important for him. Toys or teddy bears or things like that, or dolls, and he wrapped it around. But you see there are pieces of him in the exhibition. You have a look and try home to put a knot with your bare hands.
Of a garden hose.
In a garden hose.
Yeah,
Huh?
it's hard to
So that's what he did for years, but he had no communication with anyone. He's not able to speak. Was just laying in his bed and holding the pieces to him. And only when this whole situation changed in Italy, Riccardo Bargellini, he's the atelier responsible in Livorno, from Lucamelo, and he started to have a communication with him by trading. And there is a very beautiful image of Franco being inside of the room and Riccardo at the outside through the window exchanging, trading. He gave him a new toy and traded it for one of these pieces that he got. And from that moment on, this trading was a relationship between these two men that it's his way of communication, by accepting something and then making something else of it and then change it for a new one. And since then he also started to get out of his bed and of his room and to be part of this, still in the psychiatrical institution where they work, but he changed, and
part of the community.
he has this incredible collection of these kind of objects where we recognize it as being art, as being very poetical, but and brutal objects. The fact that it's a gun, for instance, I don't know if he's aware of what it is to combine. I have another image to combine this. This goat and this dog together with this wire and what that, and also the fact that it's a gun or things like that, and all the objects that he makes for us have a very contemporary appeal of being art, but we don't know if he knows or why he is doing it, or what is leading his choices in the choice of the objects, or if what is the influence of Riccardo's choice of giving him this and not this, and etc. etc. So it's the whole discussion that we had. I think with his example is very. You can have it only by his work, and again, I think the secret is the person of Franco Bellucci, of course, but also of Riccardo Bargellini, of the guy from the studio that started this whole trading, and that is, he's also part of the whole reality of Franco Bellucci's work.
So, and you can look at that whole parable, really, in a lot of different ways. You can say they have entered into an exchange that has bypassed a monetary system, but is in fact its own economy. So you can look at it as an economic system. You can look at it as a therapeutic encounter, that he has now become engaged with others in the world in a way that he was not before, and it was happening through this exchange of objects. I also wonder if he's begun to see the materials that he's been given. Did he give him this gold dog, for instance, and has it come back to him transformed? You know, so then you begin to ask, you can, I think, easily ask, and I would dismiss them, but I think you can easily ask questions about influence. It's like, oh, he's influencing him, he wouldn't have done this before. And I also think that you know, we were talking about generational issues as well. You have two very interesting generational moments going on in this project. One is the generation of this man who began his life in a very stifling institution, and now is in probably relatively less so, but still an institution, but much less than it was. So that's a generation that's going to pass, because there are, at least in this country and Western Europe, there are not really those antique kind of institutions anymore. But also there is a generation of an artist that can look at a market or an artist or a curator or a gallerist that can look at this as an art object in a way that people generations before, like Duchamp and others, with the idea of a found object and non-traditional materials, could not have looked at it as art before. So there's all, you know, so in that way, in all those ways, it's really art very much contemporary of the moment, of its era and of its time.
And our time is up.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Questions?
Well, I know we're going to,
We are here.
yeah, and I'm going to be meeting with this
All of this-
section of
these
the
folks.
audience, I gather.
Stephanie? Sorry.
We're going to be, Jerry and I are leading a study trip to some of the places that you've been, Suzanne, in outsider Europe study trip. So we'll kind of gather with folks. If the conversations want to continue.
Well, I just wanted to say that Stephanie is here too, and that she's responsible of the collection. So if you have questions about artists from the collection, she's there.
And you all will be meeting Stephanie and Pierre again in Liège at the MADmusée.
Yes.
So maybe we'll take a 5-minute break or so, and then get down to our course conversations. Our course conversations, not in the sense of about a class, not in the sense of conversation, that's course.
I'm so sorry.